Welcome to the Info Mullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the Info Mullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. Round out the top of the hour by going to Tunisia in North Africa. For those who remember, Tunisia in 2010, December 2010, let's set the stage, right? There was a seller at a market had an unlicensed stall selling just wares and goods. The economy was horrible. You had a dictator in charge in Tunisia who had been in power for his life. Very difficult economic circumstances. The police arrested this illegal seller, and in protest, he lit himself on fire. After he'd been arrested, he lit himself on fire. Didn't die at the time, but died later in hospital. And this event in sort of mid-December in Tunisia sparked what became known as the Arab Spring. And over the course of December and into early January, it was largely contained in Tunisia, and then the Tunisian dictatorship fell. The mass popular uprising in Tunisia managed to topple the dictator in Tunisia and replace it with the democratic government. At that point, the Arab Spring lit off like wildfire, and it spread to Egypt, Sudan, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. I mean, it went all over the Arab, Middle Eastern, North African, Arab populations rapidly from this main event. Tunisia now is having a repeat. They've had serial protests every few years because even though they have a democratic regime right now, the economics are not much better than they were back then. And so you've seen this kind of serial protest. In 2018, they were out protesting again, complaining about economic conditions. In 2020, they were doing it again. This right now, just in the last 5 days, they have taken to the street in mass numbers. The army has had to be deployed and to kind of quell these protests. I think there's something up to 600 arrests. They're chanting the same chants they did back at the start of the Arab Spring, and that's to topple the regime. Now, this is a democratically elected regime, but it's still been unable to handle the economic woes of Tunisia. And so what you're seeing now is almost 10 years to the month that the first dictatorship was toppled. You're seeing these same calls again and these same mass protests. Now, these protesters are not the same people as they were necessarily the first time. I've described this, and there are links in the notes for the show. I call it the new young street in the Arab world. You've seen this in Lebanon, Iraq, and Iran. I profiled it in 2019, late 2019, going into January 2020. These new young street. This is a demographic that is 18, 19, 20, so probably 16 to 22 at that point. Young people. What's different from past ones is they have no political affiliations with the existing elite. In past, even in the Arab Awakening, you would see affiliation with there'd be linkages with certain power brokers, especially in Iraq and Lebanon, where there's lots of factions, and you would have people kind of controlling the factions and trying to maneuver it. The new young street is noticeable for how divorced they are from all politics. They have lived through the first Arab Spring as children. These are the children of the Arab Spring. They watched it happen. They grew up with a certain expectations. They are completely fed up, not with one political party. So the Arab Spring tended to focus on the existing parties in power, the dictatorships that were there, Morsi in Egypt, Assad in Syria. You know, they would focus on the existing power and want change. The new young street is disgusted with all politics, regardless of it's in power or not, and they tend to be notable for being not apolitical in that they're not out protesting. They're very political, but they are not protesting on behalf of an existing faction, party, or group. That makes them it's a wild card situation. And they're almost entirely focused on economic issues, income inequality, stagnated wages, very high unemployment. We're talking 20% plus unemployment, sometimes 25%. As I talked about those factors of instability, a youth bulge, so a large population of the demographic youth relative to other generations at a high unemployment rate with failure to meet their rising expectations. This is the classic recipe that you're seeing in effect here. So I don't know. I'm not saying that Tunisia is going to spark off another round of the Arab Spring, because it's somewhat, in some cases, already underway. It got probably the news on it got suppressed because of COVID, but in Tunisia, in Lebanon, in Iraq, and Iran, you have this demographic now is violently protesting in some cases, creating extreme instability. And there may be more regime changes. Iraq may have a collapse of the country because of all the factionalism going on in there. So it's something to definitely keep an eye on. The Tunisian protests are about 5 days old now. They're very large. They're very sustained. When I do crowd analysis, these are determined protesters. So I'd keep an eye on Tunisia. And it's a weird serendipity. But as I said at the top of the hour, the Info Mullet we have been doing this Info Mullet from one version or another going back to 2002. I only started the blog and the YouTube and the Facebook really. I started the blog in 2017. I only got on Facebook and YouTube last year. I have, though, about 1,500 posts from that 2002 forward. And one of the periods I have is live coverage of the Arab Spring as it happened 10 years ago. It so happens that the first post of that coverage begins on January 25th, 2011. And that's when the protests in Egypt really took off after the Tunisian government toppled. It went over and we began to see an acceleration into Egypt. So what I've done with the volunteer help of Marie-Yves Bourdeau, I've done a tremendous job, very thankful for her help. We've recovered posts that chart the entire Arab Spring from about 2011 all the way through into it's hard to say when the Arab Spring actually ends. There's a couple different dates, but we have about 90 posts that we've recovered, and we're going to start sharing those on the Info Mullet under the historical mullets. Now, I want to be clear. These are historical mullets. These are past events. I actually label them very clearly because I don't want people to be confused as to what's being displayed. I don't want to confuse the news, but these historical Arab Spring mullets will begin being shared January 25th, 10 years after I first shared them on the predecessor to the Info Mullet. So keep an eye out on that on the Info Mullet. I'll make sure it's updated on Facebook and Twitter as well. And if you like seeing this kind of stuff, not just the current events, but also the recovery of the historical analysis, appreciate any support you can give for Patreon, www.patreon.com/infomullet. Become a mulleteer, support these kind of efforts. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the Info Mullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a mulleteer and support the Info Mullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.